The crystal champagne flute slipped from Veronica's manicured fingers the moment her mother hit the marble floor of my kitchen. Margaret Chen was convulsing on the cold stone, foam gathering at the corners of her mouth like sea spray on rocks. All I could think, standing there in my silk evening dress, was how this wasn't supposed to happen to her. My name is Eleanor Blackwood, and at 73 years old, I've learned that survival in this world requires more than just intelligence. It demands the kind of ruthless clarity that comes from decades of building an empire from nothing. When someone tries to murder you at your own retirement celebration, you notice. Especially when that someone has been circling your fortune like a vulture eyeing carrion. 4 hours earlier, my sprawling Georgian manor had been alive with the sound of success. I had just sold Blackwood Consulting for $28 million. Not bad for a company I'd built from the ashes of my husband's failed architecture firm after his death 18 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now worth more dead than alive to some people. "Mother," my son Christopher had insisted when he'd proposed this celebration, "you've earned the right to be honored. Let Veronica handle all the details. You just need to show up and accept the accolades you deserve." Christopher Blackwood, my 40-year-old son, had inherited his father's earnest brown eyes and his grandfather's talent for making terrible financial decisions. When he'd suggested that his wife Veronica orchestrate this evening, every instinct I'd honed in 4 decades of business had screamed warnings. Veronica Chen Blackwood was many things: beautiful, charming, socially connected. But domestic goddesses don't typically emerge from women who consider opening a bottle of wine to be cooking. Yet there she had been for the past 3 days, transforming my home into something worthy of Architectural Digest. Fresh orchids arranged with museum-quality precision, antique silver polished to mirror brightness, and a catering staff that moved through my house like well-trained dancers. Even I had been impressed, which should have been my first warning. The guest list read like a who's who of Boston's business elite. 37 carefully curated individuals from my professional life, select neighbors from Beacon Hill, and family. Veronica had even hired Marcus Webb, the most sought-after bartender in the city, whose services typically required booking 6 months in advance. "Nothing's too extravagant for you, Eleanor," Veronica had gushed while adjusting a flower arrangement, her perfectly applied makeup never smudging despite the tears of gratitude that seemed to flow on command. "After everything you've accomplished, you deserve to be celebrated properly." I had been making polite conversation with Robert Harrison, my former business partner and the man who'd helped broker the sale of my company, when I saw it happen. Veronica stood near the champagne station, her designer dress catching the light from the chandeliers as she glanced around the room with the nervous energy of a shoplifter. From her small beaded purse, a Judith Lieber creation that cost more than most people's monthly rent, she extracted a small amber vial. Time seemed to slow as I watched her empty the contents into a specific champagne flute. Not just any glass, but the one with the nearly imperceptible chip on the rim, a flaw I'd refused to have repaired because it had been my husband's favorite. The glass I always used at parties, the one everyone knew belonged to me. A rational person might have screamed. A sensible woman might have called the police immediately. A trusting mother-in-law might have confronted her daughter-in-law right there in front of 37 witnesses. But I hadn't survived the cutthroat world of corporate consulting by being rational, sensible, or trusting. Sometimes the most effective way to catch a predator is to let them believe they've cornered helpless prey. So I smiled, nodded at whatever Robert was saying about market volatility, and watched my daughter-in-law commit attempted murder with the same attention I'd once given to hostile takeover negotiations. Veronica lifted the doctored champagne and began walking toward me, her expression the perfect mask of loving concern. In that moment, I saw her clearly for perhaps the first time. Not the devoted wife and daughter-in-law she pretended to be, but a woman who had calculated my net worth down to the penny and found it worth killing for. "Eleanor, you look absolutely radiant tonight," she said, extending the glass toward me with hands that barely trembled. "Here, you must try this champagne. It's the Dom Perignon 2008. Christopher insisted we serve only the finest for your special evening." I accepted the glass with the same gracious smile I'd perfected in countless board meetings, thanking her warmly while my mind raced through possibilities. The amber vial had been small, perhaps an ounce of liquid at most. Whatever poison she'd chosen, it was concentrated enough to be effective in small doses, which meant she'd done her research. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was premeditated murder disguised as celebration. 10 minutes passed. I carried the glass with me as I moved through the room, accepting congratulations and making small talk while Veronica watched me from the corner of her eye. She was trying to appear engaged in conversation with the Henderson couple from next door, but her attention kept drifting back to me, waiting for the first signs of whatever she'd put in my drink. When she became distracted showing off her new tennis bracelet, a Van Cleef & Arpels creation that retailed for $40,000, I quietly switched glasses with Margaret Chen, who was standing nearby looking somewhat lost without a drink. Margaret had always been a bit scattered, poor thing, the kind of woman who could misplace her car keys while holding them. She was also, as I was about to discover, entirely innocent of her daughter's murderous plans. Margaret accepted the switch without thinking, probably grateful to have something to hold. Within 5 minutes, she was complimenting the champagne's interesting complexity and asking if I'd ordered it from a particular vintner she'd read about in Wine Spectator. "It has such an unusual finish," she had mused, taking another sip. "Almost herbal, with a slight bitter note. Very sophisticated." The rest happened with the terrible efficiency of a well-orchestrated tragedy. I knelt beside Margaret while Veronica's performance of shocked devastation began. The woman deserved an Academy Award for the way she crumpled to her knees beside her convulsing mother, her sobs echoing off the marble floors with just the right note of hysteria. But I had seen enough corporate theater to recognize the difference between genuine panic and calculated acting. Real terror has a raw, animal quality that can't be manufactured. Veronica's distress, while convincing to most observers, had the polished edges of a rehearsed performance. "What happened?" Christopher demanded, pushing through the small crowd that had gathered around Margaret's prone form. His face was pale, but I caught something else in his expression, a quick, searching glance toward Veronica that lasted just long enough to confirm my worst suspicions. 40 years of motherhood had taught me to read my son's expressions like a meteorologist reads weather patterns. Right now, Christopher looked like a man watching his carefully constructed plans collapse in real time, not like a son witnessing an unexpected medical emergency. "I don't know," Veronica sobbed, clutching my arm with perfectly manicured nails that dug into my silk sleeve. She was fine one moment, laughing and talking, and then she just collapsed. I don't understand what could have caused this. Her performance was flawless, but for one small detail. She was gripping my arm exactly where someone might steady themselves while slipping poison into a drink. The gesture was too practiced, too precise. She had rehearsed this moment, down to the physical positioning that would make her appear to be seeking comfort rather than ensuring I couldn't escape. The paramedics arrived within 7 minutes of the 911 call. Excellent response time for Beacon Hill, where the fire department knew that medical emergencies in this neighborhood often involved substantial donations to their annual fund drive. As they worked on Margaret, loading her onto a stretcher with professional efficiency, I found myself studying Christopher's face. 35 years of motherhood had given me an encyclopedia of his expressions. I knew his guilty face from childhood cookie thefts, his lying face from teenage drinking experiments, and his scheming face from his disastrous investment in cryptocurrency 3 years ago. Right now, he wore all three expressions layered like geological strata. "Which hospital?" I asked the lead paramedic, a competent-looking woman whose name tag read Rodriguez. "Massachusetts General. Are you family?" "Close family friend," I said, glancing meaningfully at Veronica, who was too busy hyperventilating to notice the exchange. "I'll follow in my car." Christopher stepped forward with suspicious speed. "Mother, that's not necessary. Veronica and I can handle everything. You should stay here, help supervise the cleanup, make sure the staff takes care of everything properly." How thoughtful of him to want to keep me at home while they figured out why their carefully planned murder had gone wrong. "Nonsense," I said with a firmness that had once convinced Fortune 500 executives to accept unfavorable merger terms. "Margaret is practically family. I wouldn't dream of abandoning her at a time like this." I collected my purse and keys before anyone could mount further objections, noting how Christopher's jaw tightened when he realized I wouldn't be contained as easily as they'd hoped. Massachusetts General's Emergency Department at 11 p.m. was a symphony of controlled chaos. Heart monitors beeping, phones ringing, and the constant shuffle of medical professionals responding to crises. I positioned myself close enough to the nurse's station to overhear conversations, while maintaining the appearance of an anxiously waiting family friend. Margaret's condition was officially listed as acute poisoning of unknown origin, but I caught fragments of more specific information as doctors and nurses discussed her case. The attending physician mentioned something about plant alkaloids to his resident, compounds specific enough to suggest someone had done considerable research into untraceable toxins. The levels suggest concentrated digitalis or possibly oleander extract, I overheard the toxicologist explain to a nurse. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. This isn't someone who Googled household poisons. This required pharmaceutical-level knowledge. Veronica paced the waiting room like a caged panther, her Louboutin heels clicking against the linoleum in a rhythm that seemed to count down her mounting anxiety. Christopher sat rigidly in a plastic chair that had probably cost less than his tie. His phone buzzing constantly with messages he seemed reluctant to answer. "This is just devastating," Veronica announced for what must have been the 8th time since we'd arrived. "Poor mother. I can't begin to imagine how something like this could happen. She's always been so careful about what she eats and drinks." I patted her shoulder with what I hoped appeared to be sympathy. "These medical mysteries can be so frightening, dear. I'm sure the doctors will determine the cause soon enough." Then I added, with the casual tone of someone making idle conversation, "It's fortunate Margaret didn't consume more of whatever caused this reaction. She'd only taken a few sips of champagne before she collapsed. Imagine how much worse it might have been." Veronica's step faltered almost imperceptibly. "Champagne? You think the champagne caused Mother's condition?" "Oh, I'm sure it was nothing like that," I said with a dismissive wave. "Just an old woman's mind looking for patterns where none exist. I'm certain it was something completely unrelated." But Veronica's face had lost another shade of color, and her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. Christopher was watching our exchange with the intensity of a securities analyst studying quarterly reports, clearly trying to determine how much I suspected and whether their cover story was holding. 3 hours later, Dr. Amanda Foster emerged from the treatment area to give us an update. She was the kind of doctor who inspired confidence. Mid-40s, silver-streaked hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, and the bearing of someone who had seen enough medical mysteries to approach each one with healthy skepticism. "Mrs. Chen is stable," Dr. Foster announced, "and we expect her to make a full recovery. However, she'll need to remain here for observation while the toxin works its way out of her system." "Toxin?" Veronica's voice cracked slightly. "The doctors confirmed she was poisoned." "The blood work shows clear evidence of plant-based alkaloid poisoning," Dr. Foster confirmed. "The specific compound is still being analyzed, but Mrs. Chen was definitely exposed to a concentrated botanical toxin. Do you know of any medications or supplements she might have taken? Herbal remedies, perhaps?" Christopher and Veronica exchanged a look that lasted approximately 2 seconds longer than it should have. "Mother doesn't take any medications," Veronica said carefully. "She's always been very healthy, very careful about what she puts in her body." Dr. Foster made a note on her clipboard. "Has she been anywhere recently where she might have come into contact with unfamiliar plants? A botanical garden, perhaps, or a new restaurant that serves exotic cuisines?" "She was at a retirement party this evening," I interjected helpfully. "My retirement celebration, actually. Quite a lovely affair with catered food and champagne service." Dr. Foster's attention sharpened. "Was Mrs. Chen the only person who became ill?" "Yes," Veronica said quickly. "Everyone else felt fine. It couldn't have been the food or drinks. We all had the same things." "Actually," I corrected gently, "not everyone had exactly the same things. The champagne service was quite varied. Different vintages, different bottles opened at different times." Margaret was particularly impressed with one specific champagne that had what she called an interesting herbal finish. The color drained from Christopher's face. Veronica gripped the arm of her chair so tightly that her knuckles went white. Dr. Foster looked between us with the expression of someone who had just realized that this wasn't a simple case of accidental poisoning. "I think," she said carefully, "that we should contact the police. This situation warrants a more thorough investigation." "Is that really necessary?" Christopher asked, his voice slightly hoarse. "I mean, if Mother is going to be fine, and it was obviously some kind of accident." "Mr. Blackwood," Dr. Foster said, her tone leaving no room for argument, "someone consumed a potentially lethal dose of botanical toxin at a social gathering. The police need to investigate the source to ensure this doesn't happen to anyone else." As Dr. Foster walked away to make her calls, I watched Christopher and Veronica have what appeared to be an urgent whispered conversation. Their body language spoke volumes. Christopher kept running his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his teenage years when he'd been caught in lies. Veronica was gesturing sharply with her hands, her careful composure finally beginning to crack. "Can we see her?" Veronica asked when Dr. Foster returned. "Family only, and she's heavily sedated. The toxin caused significant neurological distress. It's best to let her rest until morning." As we prepared to leave the hospital, Christopher walked me to my car with the solicitous concern of a devoted son. "Mother, I really think you should stay with us tonight. After what happened to Margaret, I'd feel much better knowing you weren't alone." How considerate, especially since Margaret's poisoning had probably left them wondering whether I suspected their involvement. The answer was yes. I absolutely suspected them, but they didn't need to know the extent of my knowledge yet. "That's very sweet, dear, but I'll be perfectly safe at home. I have that new security system, remember?" I kissed his cheek and got into my Mercedes, watching in my rearview mirror as he rejoined Veronica for what looked like an increasingly heated discussion in the hospital parking lot. My home at 3 a.m. felt different than it had 6 hours earlier. The catering staff had cleaned everything with professional efficiency. Crystal glasses washed and stored, silver service polished and put away, flowers arranged in vases throughout the house. It looked like a museum exhibit titled "Elegant Entertaining," but it felt like a crime scene. I poured myself a glass of wine from a fresh bottle, checking the seal carefully, and settled into my study. The room had been my sanctuary for 18 years, ever since Richard's death had forced me to transform myself from grieving widow to business mogul. The walls were lined with first editions and business awards. The desk was a 19th-century mahogany piece that had belonged to my grandfather, and the Persian rug had been a gift to myself when I'd closed my first $10 million consulting contract. Tonight it would serve as my war room. I spent the pre-dawn hours doing what I'd done successfully in business for 4 decades. Gathering intelligence. Not the kind of research you conduct with computers and databases, but the more valuable kind that comes from memory, observation, and the ability to recognize patterns that others miss. Margaret's poisoning hadn't been random, and it certainly hadn't been accidental. Someone had planned to murder me at my own celebration, probably hoping to make it appear natural. At 73, sudden cardiac events or strokes are common enough that few people question them, especially when they occur during stressful or emotionally significant moments. The sale of my life's work could easily have provided the cover story for a natural death. But why now? That was the $28 million question. I retrieved my checkbook and began reconstructing Christopher and Veronica's financial history with me. The numbers told a story that was both pathetic and infuriating. Christopher's architectural firm, Blackwood Design Associates, had been hemorrhaging money since the 2008 recession and had never fully recovered. What I had assumed was a temporary setback had apparently become a permanent state of near bankruptcy. Veronica's boutique jewelry business, Luminous Designs, existed primarily on paper and in her social media presence. Her showroom was a rented space in the Back Bay that she used maybe twice a month for appointment-only viewings. The business generated barely enough revenue to cover its overhead, and certainly not enough to support their lifestyle. Yet they lived like tech billionaires. The house in Newton's most exclusive neighborhood carried a mortgage that was 4 times what Christopher's firm could reasonably service. The Mercedes-AMG and BMW X7 in their driveway represented more than $200,000 in automotive debt. Veronica's wardrobe alone could have funded a small non-profit's annual budget. I had helped them, of course. What mother wouldn't? Looking through my financial records, I tallied nearly $300,000 in gifts over the past 7 years. The house down payment when Veronica had wept about wanting to start their family in the right environment. Private school tuition for Isabella when they'd insisted public education wasn't adequate for their daughter's potential. Emergency business loans when Christopher claimed his firm was experiencing temporary cash flow problems. Never loans, always gifts. I had insisted on that distinction, thinking it preserved family harmony by removing the obligation of repayment. Now I wondered if that generosity had been interpreted differently, not as motherly love, but as down payments on an inheritance they were tired of waiting to collect. The phone rang at 7:30 a.m., jarring me from my financial archaeology. Veronica's voice was thick with exhaustion and what sounded like genuine concern. "Eleanor, I've been awake all night worrying about you," she said. "After what happened to Mother, I can't stop thinking that maybe there was something wrong with the catering or the drinks. You didn't feel ill at all last night, did you?" How thoughtful of her to check whether her poison had reached its intended target. "Not at all, dear. I feel perfectly fine. How is Margaret this morning?" "The doctors say she should be released this afternoon. They think she must have had an allergic reaction to something she ate before the party. You know how she is, always trying new health supplements and exotic teas. She probably took something that interacted badly with the champagne." Margaret Chen was many things, but careless with supplements was not one of them. The woman approached vitamins and herbal remedies with the systematic precision of a pharmacist, complete with detailed spreadsheets tracking dosages and interactions. If Margaret had been poisoned by a supplement, she would have documentation proving exactly what she'd taken and when. "That's such a relief," I said. "I was worried it might have been something from the party. That would have been terrible for everyone involved." "Oh no, definitely not," Veronica said with suspicious speed. "The doctors were very clear that it wasn't food poisoning or anything like that. Just an unfortunate coincidence." Interesting how quickly she wanted to shut down any investigation into what had happened at my house. Almost as if she was worried someone might test the remaining champagne bottles and discover exactly what kind of coincidence had nearly killed her mother. After ending the call, I walked to my kitchen and examined the Dom Perignon bottle that had been opened for the party. 3/4 full, sitting innocently on my granite countertop like evidence waiting to be collected. I wondered what a laboratory analysis would reveal, though I hardly needed scientific confirmation of what I'd witnessed. My doorbell chimed at 9 o'clock. Christopher stood on my front porch holding a bakery box from Tat, looking every inch the concerned son, making sure his mother had breakfast after a difficult evening. "Thought you might not have eaten," he said, kissing my cheek with what appeared to be genuine affection. "Last night was pretty traumatic for everyone." I let him into my kitchen and made fresh coffee while he arranged croissants and pastries on my good china. Watching him move through the space where he'd grown up, opening cabinets without asking where things were kept, reaching for cream and sugar from their usual locations, I felt an unexpected wave of sadness. This was still my little boy, the child who had brought me dandelions from the garden and proudly displayed his elementary school artwork on my refrigerator. When had that sweet, earnest child transformed into a man who could stand by while his wife attempted to murder his mother? "How are you processing everything, Mother?" he asked, settling across from me at the breakfast table where we'd shared thousands of meals over the years. "You know me, dear. It takes more than a medical emergency to rattle these old bones." He attempted a smile, but it never reached his eyes. "That's exactly what worries me, actually." An odd response. I sipped my coffee and waited for him to elaborate. "The thing is," Christopher continued, methodically dissecting a chocolate croissant, "Veronica and I have been talking about your situation." "My situation?" "You're 73, Mother. Living alone in this enormous house with $28 million from the sale. It just seems like a lot for one person to manage alone. There it was, the opening gambit of whatever strategy they'd developed to replace their failed poisoning attempt. I appreciate your concern, Christopher, but I've been managing my affairs quite successfully for some time. Christopher leaned forward, adopting the earnest expression that had convinced me to fund so many of his bad decisions over the years. Have you, though? I mean, last night's situation with Margaret. What if that had been you? What if you'd collapsed and been alone here for hours before anyone found you? The audacity was breathtaking. He was using their failed murder attempt as justification for why I needed their protection. Margaret collapsed at a party with nearly 40 witnesses and paramedics arrived within minutes. Hardly a cautionary tale about the dangers of living alone. That's not what I mean. He ran both hands through his hair. The gesture was becoming more frequent, which meant his stress levels were escalating. Look, Veronica and I have been researching options for you. There are some really excellent communities for active seniors, places where you'd have social interaction, organized activities, and medical staff available around the clock. The nursing home pitch. How convenient that they'd already been researching my institutionalization options. How thoughtful of you to look into that. Did you find something specific? Actually, yes. He produced his phone and showed me a glossy website. Meridian Heights. It's only 15 minutes from our house, so we could visit frequently. They have a golf course, spa facilities, cultural programs. It's more like a luxury resort than a traditional retirement community. I studied the photographs of silver-haired people playing bridge, doing water aerobics, and participating in art classes. Everyone looked blissfully content, probably because they were heavily medicated and had surrendered all control over their lives to their caring families. The only complication, Christopher continued, is that there's typically a lengthy waiting list. However, if someone wanted to secure immediate placement, they'd need to pay the full entrance fee up front. It's substantial, around $600,000, but it covers housing, meals, and medical care for life. $600,000. That would create a significant reduction in my liquid assets, wouldn't it? And once I was safely installed at Meridian Heights, who would be granted power of attorney over the remaining $27 million? Who would be making decisions about my care, my living arrangements, and my money? It sounds lovely, I said carefully, but you know how much this house means to me. Your father and I created so many memories here. Mother, Dad's been gone for 18 years. Don't you think it's time to start a new chapter of your life? The gentle, reasonable tone made my heart ache. If I hadn't witnessed Veronica's attempted murder, I might have actually considered his suggestion. My devoted son, worried about his aging mother's welfare and wanting to ensure she was safe and well cared for. It would have been touching instead of terrifying. I'll consider it, I said diplomatically. It's obviously a major decision that requires careful thought. Christopher's relief was visible in the way his shoulders relaxed. Of course. Take all the time you need. Maybe we could drive out there next week, just to look around and get a feel for the place. Perhaps. I stood and began clearing our breakfast dishes. You know, I should call Margaret today. Make sure she's recovering well. Actually, Mother, Veronica asked me to mention that Margaret probably needs complete rest for the next few days. Her doctor specifically said that visitors might be too stimulating while the toxins work their way out of her system. How convenient. Keep me away from the victim until the evidence was metabolized and her memories became unclear due to the trauma and sedation. After Christopher left, I returned to my study and considered timing. They had waited until after I sold my company to make their move, which showed considerable strategic thinking. If I had died 6 months ago, my estate would have passed to Christopher according to my existing will, but the tax implications would have been different. Killing me now, especially if they could manufacture evidence of declining mental capacity, would give them grounds to challenge any recent changes to my estate planning. The phone rang, interrupting my analysis. My attorney, Thomas Richardson, was returning a call I'd placed earlier that morning. Eleanor, good to hear from you. I trust the retirement celebration went well. Eventful would be a more accurate description, I replied. Thomas, I need to see you today. It's urgent. Is everything all right? I looked out my study window at the garden Richard had designed 20 years earlier. The roses were blooming magnificently despite having only an elderly woman to tend them. An elderly woman who apparently couldn't be trusted to manage her own life. I'm not entirely certain, I said, but I suspect I'm about to find out. Thomas Richardson had been my attorney for 22 years, which meant he'd guided me through Richard's death, the transformation of his failed business into my consulting empire, and every significant legal decision since. A tall, distinguished man in his early 60s with silver hair and the kind of understated confidence that comes from decades of protecting wealthy clients from their own families, Thomas was exactly the kind of lawyer you wanted when you suspected your loved ones were planning your murder. His office occupied the corner of a prestigious building overlooking Boston Common, all burnished wood panels and leather furniture designed to project both gravitas and discretion. I had always felt secure here, surrounded by law books and the faint aroma of expensive cologne that seemed to permeate everything Thomas touched. Tell me everything, Thomas said after his assistant brought us Earl Grey tea and closed the door with the practiced silence of someone accustomed to confidential conversations. I recounted every detail from the previous evening. Veronica's suspicious behavior, Margaret's collapse, Christopher's morning visit. Thomas listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on his monogrammed legal pad with a fountain pen that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. You're absolutely certain about what you observed? He asked when I finished my account. As certain as I am of anything in this world. Thomas leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against his lips in a gesture I'd seen him make countless times when processing complex legal problems. The challenge is establishing provable intent. Veronica could claim she was adding something harmless to the champagne, a flavor enhancer, a vitamin supplement, something personal that she thought would benefit you. Then we need to test the remaining champagne. Even if we find poison, we still can't definitively prove she intended to kill you specifically. Her defense attorney could argue she was targeting her own mother for insurance money, or that the poison was meant for someone else entirely. I hadn't considered that angle, but Thomas was right. Even with physical evidence of the poisoning, they might escape murder charges by claiming Margaret had been the intended victim. There's something else we need to discuss, Thomas continued, his expression growing more serious. If Christopher and Veronica are willing to attempt murder for your money, they may try other approaches first. Legal challenges to your mental competency, for instance. On what grounds? Your age, living alone, the stress of selling your business. If they can establish a pattern of declining judgment or questionable decision-making, they could petition for guardianship. Once they control your person, they automatically control your assets. The nursing home suggestion suddenly made perfect sense. Get me isolated in an institutional setting, surrounded by medical professionals who might be willing to document signs of confusion or dementia, especially if those professionals were receiving substantial financial incentives for their observations. What do I need to do? Thomas opened a file drawer and extracted a thick folder. First, we document your current mental state comprehensively. I'll arrange for you to be evaluated by Dr. Patricia Vance, who specializes in competency assessments for elderly clients. She's completely independent and has an impeccable reputation. Get that evaluation on record immediately. And then we restructure your estate planning to make it nearly impossible for anyone to challenge your decisions or access your money without your explicit consent. Thomas's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. If Christopher and Veronica want to play legal games with your fortune, we'll make sure they're playing by rules that heavily favor the house. We spent the next 3 hours reviewing options that I never could have imagined needing. Trust structures that would trigger automatic audits if anyone attempted unauthorized access to my accounts. Medical directives that specified exactly who could and could not make healthcare decisions on my behalf. Financial arrangements that would immediately transfer my assets to charity if anyone successfully challenged my mental competency. There's one more issue we should address, Thomas said as I prepared to leave. Given what you've told me about last night, I think we need to consider your personal safety. If they attempted murder once, they'll likely try again, probably with more sophisticated methods. I thought about Christopher's suggestion that I stay at their house the previous evening. How convenient that would have been. A distraught elderly woman, overwhelmed by her friend's sudden illness, perhaps taking a sedative to help her sleep. So easy for someone to accidentally overdose on medication when they're emotionally fragile. What do you recommend? Comprehensive security upgrades, for starters. Motion sensors, cameras, a panic button system that connects directly to police dispatch. I can recommend a company that specializes in protection for high-net-worth individuals who face threats from within their own families. High-net-worth individuals threatened by their own families. Apparently, this was common enough to constitute a specialized market segment. Driving home through Boston's afternoon traffic, I found myself scrutinizing every vehicle in my mirrors, wondering if I was being followed. Paranoia, probably, but as Richard used to say, it's not paranoia if people really are trying to kill you. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. Veronica's voice was bright with artificial cheer, like a radio DJ announcing contest winners. Eleanor, wonderful news. Mother is being released from the hospital this afternoon. She's feeling much better, though the doctor said she might not remember much about last night. Apparently, that's completely normal with this type of medical incident. How perfectly convenient for their story. I'm so relieved she's recovering. I'd love to visit her tomorrow and make sure she has everything she needs. Oh, that's very thoughtful, but she's really not up for visitors yet. The doctors want her to have complete rest for at least a week. I'll definitely let you know when she's ready for company. Of course, dear. Just tell her I'm thinking of her and I'm grateful she's all right. After disconnecting, I sat in my car for several minutes, looking at the house that had been my home for 3 decades. Richard and I had bought it when Christopher was 12, full of dreams about family gatherings and holiday traditions. The mortgage had seemed enormous then, but we'd been young and optimistic, certain that hard work and love would solve any problem. Now it felt like a fortress under siege. But I'd learned enough in 4 decades of business to know that sometimes the best defense requires a strategic offense. Time to demonstrate what a 73-year-old woman with resources and determination could accomplish when her survival was at stake. The security installation team arrived at 8 the next morning in 3 unmarked vans that could have belonged to any utility company. I had told my neighbors I was upgrading my home automation system, plausible enough in a neighborhood where smart houses were becoming standard. By afternoon, my home had better surveillance and protection than most corporate headquarters. Motion sensors tracked movement in every room and throughout the grounds. Cameras with night vision capabilities covered every entrance and window. A panic button system could summon police response within 90 seconds, and the monitoring company had been briefed to treat any alert from my address as a potential life-threatening emergency. But the Real security arrived at 2 o'clock in the form of an envelope delivered by Thomas's messenger service. My updated will, trust documents and medical directives, all properly witnessed, notarized, and filed with the appropriate authorities. If Christopher and Veronica wanted access to my money, they would have to wait for me to die of natural causes, and they would receive far less than they expected. The new will reduced Christopher's inheritance from everything to a modest trust fund that would provide him with $75,000 annually for life, enough to live comfortably, but nowhere near enough to sustain their current extravagant lifestyle. The bulk of my estate would fund cancer research and several educational charities I'd supported over the years. As for Veronica, she would receive nothing. Not a single penny. I had never particularly liked the woman, but I tolerated her for Christopher's sake and for the sake of family harmony. Attempted murder, however, was where I drew every line I possessed. The trust structures Thomas had created were particularly elegant in their complexity. If anyone attempted to challenge my mental competency after these documents were executed, the trusts would automatically transfer all assets to charity, making any legal victory Pyrrhic at best. The medical directives specified that only doctors with no financial relationship to my family could make determinations about my care. Power of attorney could only be granted to licensed attorneys with fiduciary responsibility, never to family members. Most importantly, the documents included what Thomas called dead man switches, automatic triggers that would immediately freeze all accounts and initiate law enforcement investigations if I died under suspicious circumstances, if I suddenly changed my estate plans under pressure, or if anyone attempted to have me committed to any care facility without multiple independent medical opinions. It's like building a financial fortress, Thomas had explained during our planning session. Every approach they might take has been anticipated and blocked. They can't access your money, they can't control your person, and they can't benefit from your death under any circumstances. I was reviewing these documents one final time when my doorbell rang. The security monitor showed Christopher and Veronica standing on my front porch, both looking unusually grim. "Showtime. Mother, we need to talk," Christopher said the moment I opened the door, his voice carrying an edge I'd rarely heard from him. "Of course, dear. Please come in." They settled in my living room with the careful positioning of people preparing for a difficult conversation. Veronica perched on the edge of the sofa like she might need to flee at any moment, while Christopher's gaze lingered on the new security camera mounted discreetly in the corner. "New security system?" he asked, nodding toward the camera. "Package theft," I replied smoothly. "You can't be too careful in any neighborhood these days." Veronica cleared her throat delicately. "Eleanor, we've been thinking about what happened the other night with Mother's medical emergency." "Yes. Well, we feel absolutely terrible about hosting the celebration here. What if something we brought or arranged caused her to become ill?" She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue that appeared to have been prepared for this performance. "I would never forgive myself if we accidentally put anyone in danger." I watched this carefully rehearsed scene with professional appreciation. Veronica had clearly been practicing her concerned daughter-in-law routine. "I'm certain it wasn't anything related to the party, dear. These medical incidents can be completely random." "But what if it wasn't random?" Christopher leaned forward with manufactured urgency. "What if there was something wrong with the catering or the champagne? Mother, I'd never forgive myself if we had unknowingly created a dangerous situation for you." Here it came, the justification for whatever new strategy they devised. "The point is," Veronica continued, "we think it would be safer if we took care of you for a while. Just temporarily, until we can be absolutely certain that you're not at risk." "Took care of me how?" "You could stay with us," Christopher said. "Just until we figure out what happened with Margaret and make sure it couldn't happen again." I allowed the silence to stretch, watching their faces carefully. Christopher looked genuinely worried. He'd always been gifted at convincing himself that his motivations were pure. Veronica looked like a woman whose credit card payments were overdue and whose backup plan had just failed spectacularly. "That's very thoughtful," I said finally, "but I feel perfectly safe here." "But are you safe?" Veronica's voice developed a sharp edge. "You're 73 years old, Eleanor, living alone in this enormous house. What if something happens and no one discovers you for days?" The same argument Christopher had made the previous morning. They were definitely working from a prepared script. "What if you have a fall?" Christopher added. "Or a heart attack? Mother, at your age, any small incident could become a catastrophe." My age. As if 73 meant I was already deceased and simply hadn't realized it yet. "You know," I said thoughtfully, "you're absolutely right to be concerned about these things. That's precisely why I spent yesterday updating my will and estate planning." The temperature in my living room dropped noticeably. "You could have used the silence to preserve food." "Your will?" Veronica's voice was carefully controlled. "Oh yes. It's remarkable how a brush with mortality, even someone else's mortality, makes you reconsider your priorities. I realized my previous estate planning was terribly outdated and didn't reflect my current values." Christopher's face had lost most of its color. "What kind of updates?" I smiled at him with the same expression I'd used when he was 10 years old and I'd caught him lying about breaking my favorite lamp. "Just some adjustments to better align my legacy with causes I believe in. You understand how these things evolve as one gets older." The silence that followed was profound. I could practically hear their mental calculations as they tried to determine how catastrophically their plans had been disrupted. "Well," Veronica said finally, her voice tight with barely controlled panic, "I'm sure whatever decisions you made were appropriate." "I certainly hope so, dear." They departed shortly after, making vague promises to check on me soon. I watched from my security monitor as they sat in their BMW for 15 minutes in my driveway, engaged in what appeared to be an increasingly heated argument. Veronica was gesturing angrily while Christopher kept trying to take her phone away from her. When she finally made a call, I could see her shouting at whoever answered, though the audio pickup wasn't sensitive enough to capture her words. After they drove away, I poured myself a glass of Bordeaux, checking the bottle carefully, and settled into my favorite armchair. Tomorrow would bring phase 2 of my plan, but tonight I intended to savor the first genuinely peaceful evening I'd experienced since Margaret's collapse. There's something deeply satisfying about watching your enemies realize they've fundamentally underestimated their target. The game was just beginning, and I'd been playing it considerably longer than they had.